explain to me how she went over the edge of that cliff.
Says, I don't love you anyway, and gave me a push. And it pissed me off enough to where I gave her a push.
Something happened there, Dennis. You guys argued, something happened. Are you telling me the truth?
Yeah, it did.
I didn't ask you whether it fits. I want to know if it's the truth.
No, it's the truth.
One hour south of Great Falls, the original route of Lewis and Clark runs along the Missouri River and through the Little Belt Mountains. Splintered off the Missouri is a small tributary, known to the locals as Prickly Pear Creek. On a summer day, a young couple, Lesie and Dennis Larson, walk along the creek bank, looking to pick some mushrooms. An hour later, the mushrooms remain unpicked, and Lesie Larson has gone missing. Dan LaFramboise is an off-duty Montana patrolman. He's waiting on his vehicle to be serviced at a local gas station when a car comes speeding down the road and screeches to a stop. A man gets out.
He run across the street, and he run up to me, and he hollered, he says, "My wife just fell in the creek and she drowned."
The man says his name is Dennis Larson. He asks LaFramboise to follow him back to Prickly Pear Creek. On the way, Larson tells the lawman that his wife, Lesie, slipped and fell into the water. Spring rains had swollen the creek, making it deep and wide, with a dangerous current that dragged Lesie under. LaFramboise listens to Larson's story, but doesn't believe a word of it.
He said that he'd jumped into the creek to try to save his wife and try to find her. And he says, I jumped in at that first log jam. And he says, I just about got washed into that. And he says, I crawled out. And I says, pretty deep, huh? And he says, oh yeah, way up like this. Well, he wasn't wet. And I thought, what's going on here? That doesn't sound right.
LaFramboise calls for backup, then begins to search the area. He follows the current downstream, figuring Leslie's body would get caught up in one of several log jams on the creek. The trooper, however, finds no sign of a body. Within the hour, sheriff's deputies arrive and take over the investigation. LaFramboise briefs them on what he has found, leaving them with a final suspicious fact.
And I said, because where he showed me she fell in the creek, I said there was one set of tracks going down there, and those were his. There was no woman's track in there at all. And I said she had never been there, unless he carried her.
While a search team continues to hunt for Lesie, her father, Bill Reynolds, is notified of the tragedy. Mr. Reynolds then places the worst kind of phone call to his wife, Leslie's mother, Lois.
I could tell something was drastically wrong because he was in tears, and he wanted me to come right home. And I said, well, what's going on? He said, well, Lesie died. She drowned, and you've got to come home because I have to have you here.
By the time Lois returns to Great Falls the following day, county authorities have already closed the case, determining the drowning to be an accident. The finding does not sit well with LaFramboise.
I didn't think it was right, but there wasn't anything I could do with it. I mean, it was out of my jurisdiction.
Unofficially, and on his own time, Dan LaFramboise teams up with the victim's parents to search the creek until they find a body.
I went back down that creek, I don't know how many times, twice within the next week and a half, 10 days, and I walked it going down, come back, I'd go down again, I'd come back. I never could find sign of her.
A month after Leslie's disappearance, floodwaters have receded, and the creek is back to running calm and clear. Still, the hunt for Lesie continues.
We examined every spot on that creek, from Wolf Creek down and past where it goes into the river. My husband and his friend took a boat, examined every shoreline, every small island in that area, clear down, including in the Missouri River.
Days of searching turns up nothing. Then Laframboise switches tactics and begins to watch the area wildlife, hoping a Montana black bear might lead him to Lesie Larson's remains.
I said, if there's a body or anything down in that river bottom or in that creek bottom, I said, the bears are going to find her. They'll point her out, they'll dig her out. If she's in a gravel bar or something like that, they'll dig her up. So I started watching the bears. They never dug up anything. And there's bears all over that place.
The longer he searches, the more convinced Laframboise becomes that Lesie Larson never fell into Prickly Pear Creek, and that Dennis Larson's story is just a cover for murder.
I thought all the time there was something like that it wasn't right, he wasn't telling the truth, or he wasn't telling the whole story, and he was hiding something.
We went back to that creek every weekend without fail, 4 years. And we took metal detectors, we took cadaver dogs, just plain shovels, some instances. Even Larson himself went with us a few times, but he was not helping in the search. He was just strolling along.
Over time, Lois Reynolds comes to share the lawman's suspicions that Lesie was killed by her husband, Dennis. She discovers tracts of mining land owned by Larson's family and wonders if perhaps she might find her daughter's body there.
I had known that Larson had 2 mines in the Little Belt, and they took a lot of equipment up there and dug the whole thing out. That didn't prove to be of any value, and then somebody reminded us of a mine out of Wolf Creek, and it was not in operation anymore. And they came with a big semi with a whole bunch of radar and all kinds of equipment, and they dug out that mine as far as they could go.
Despite hundreds of search days and dozens of digs, neither police nor family can turn up a trace of Lesie Larson, and the disappearance goes cold. Meanwhile, Dennis Larson collects on his wife's insurance policy, one with a double indemnity clause, meaning that since Lesie died of an apparent accident, Dennis Larson gets double the money. The bereaved husband then moves cross-country to the state of Maine, where he finds himself another bride, another insurance policy, and yet another accident, this time at the bottom of an 80-foot cliff. Kathy Frost is a 26-year-old single woman. One day in August, she spots a personal ad from a man describing himself as an outdoorsman and seeking a lasting relationship. The man's name is Dennis Larson. Kathy and Dennis begin a courtship. Within 3 weeks, Dennis proposes. Kathy mulls her decision over with her mother, Audrey Pomeroy.
She was lonely. She wanted somebody to love and to be with, do things with. So she said that she found a man and that she was going to marry him. Wanted to get married in February 14th, Valentine's Day.
Dennis Larson does not want to wait for Valentine's Day. Less than a month after they first met, Dennis and Kathy are married. The next day, Dennis Larson takes out an insurance policy on Kathy Larson's life. It includes a double indemnity clause that will pay nearly $400,000 if Kathy dies in an accident. 3 weeks later, the couple takes a trip to the high cliffs of Acadia National Park. Acadia sits on Mount Desert Island, off the coast of central Maine. A haven for campers, hikers, and day trippers, the park sees nearly 3 million visitors each year. By 6 p.m., most of the crowds have left for the day. That is when Dennis and Kathy Larson arrive and make their way to Otter Cliffs, a rugged area with a clear view of the open ocean and a sheer 80-foot drop to the water below. At 7 o'clock, a call comes in to the National Park Service Ranger Station. Ranger Boyd McFarland is in the area and takes the call.
We received a call on the park radio of a report of a woman fallen off the cliffs. They called up our communications office, who notified me.
A man named Dennis Larson has reported that his wife fell from Otter Cliffs. The ranger sets off to meet Larson at the scene.
I met him up at the road, and then we came down here, and he showed me where she had fallen and where she had landed.
McFarland walks carefully to the edge and looks over the drop. Kathy Larson is sprawled below. Dennis claims they were hiking together, looking for otters, when he heard a scream. Larson turned around and Kathy was gone. National Park Search and Rescue arrive on the scene, hoping to resuscitate, but Kathy is dead. Initially, park rangers have no reason to believe the death is anything other than an accident. A phone call to Kathy Frost's mother begins to change their minds.
Deep down in my heart, something was wrong. Something happened that it wasn't natural, because she hated heights. And I know she wouldn't have been up there on that mountain. She wouldn't have done it if she wasn't made to do it.
Audrey Pomeroy shares her suspicions with the park rangers. First, there is her daughter's fear of the cliffs. Second, there is the insurance policy on Kathy's life. Third, Audrey had heard rumors about Dennis's first wife, who disappeared. The Maine State Police are called in to investigate. Detective Jeff Harmon takes the case. He calls Audrey Pomeroy to find out more about her daughter and her relationship with Dennis Larson.
She had been an individual, hadn't had a lot of relationships with men at the past. All of a sudden had met Dennis Larson, was going to get married. There had been some discussion about life insurance. She just had a bad feeling about this and felt that something had gone wrong down at the park, and that she was absolutely convinced this wasn't an accident.
Harmon believes Audrey's suspicions might be worth checking out. He calls up a local cop in Montana, Cascade County Detective Ken Anderson, and asks him to run a check on Larson and any reports about his first wife's supposed accident.
I started doing research on Dennis and pulled up his name and found that he had lost his wife in an accidental drowning back in 1975.
So working with the local officials, we were able to obtain the reports of the initial accidental death. In that particular case, he had purchased insurance. All of this kind of fit together in a pattern of someone who had been involved in a death case, an accidental death case before, had collected insurance money on it, was motivated to try to obtain a large sum of money so he could maintain his lifestyle.
To the eye of seasoned detectives, the pattern is clear. Harmon and Anderson both believe Dennis Larson killed his wife in Montana. Figured he got away with it, then killed again in Maine, each time collecting on a double indemnity insurance policy. The detectives decide it's time to turn the screws on Dennis Larson and bring him in for questioning.
You explain to me how she went over the edge of that cliff.
There's no way anybody that didn't see it can explain it.
During his investigation, Jeff Harmon has leaned a bit on his suspect. Enough so that Dennis Larson decides to leave the state and head back west.
Dennis had told me that he was going to go back to Montana. Psychologically, I think he was becoming very stressed over this. You could see a gradual degradation in his personality. And I think that he wanted to get some distance between the investigation and himself.
2 months after Larson returns to Montana, Harmon follows him there and asks his suspect to sit down for an interview. In room 411 of the Sheraton Great Falls, Jeff Harmon sits across from Dennis Larson, murder suspect. What Larson doesn't know is that Harmon is wearing a body wire. In the next room, Montana Detective Ken Anderson is recording their conversation.
The only thing I'm interested in is what the facts are, is what happened, what the truth about exactly what happened.
Harmon lays out for Dennis Larson his suspicions about the case and presents a key piece of evidence in the form of a medical examiner's report. It identifies bruises on Kathy Larson's arms that are not consistent with her other injuries from the fall. Bruises that are consistent with someone grabbing her forcefully, dragging her to the edge of a cliff, and throwing her over.
Yeah, there's marks there. Kathy didn't put those marks on herself. And there's nobody else there but you and her. And we discussed before.
Okay, look, I know that those marks are there because I can see them.
That's right.
So all I can do is theorize as to what happened because...
The marks are there, Dennis.
Yeah.
Okay,
she's
not
ready to fall, right? Why couldn't she go like that?
They're not caused by her.
How do you know?
Dennis, they are not caused by her.
Dennis Larson bobs and weaves, but can come up with no satisfactory explanation for the marks on his dead wife's arms. Harmon continues to push, and Larson finally breaks, sort of.
There was a dramatic change in the story from started out being purely an accident to there being an argument to there being an argument with a physical confrontation.
Guess we went down by the cliff, and she says, "I don't love you anyway," and gave me a push. And it pissed me off enough to where I gave her a push. And we weren't all that close to the cliff, but I pushed her hard enough to where she stumbled backwards and went off and scraped her belly and fell over the cliff.
Larson crafts his story to cover the bruises on Kathy's arms, but does not go so far as to confess to premeditated murder. Still, Jeff Harmon believes that Larson's statements will be the crux of his circumstantial case. The suspect is arrested on charges of insurance fraud and remanded to the county jail while Harmon works on getting him extradited to Maine. Before he leaves, Dennis Larson agrees to an interview with a local news reporter. In this interview, he makes his case for innocence.
I wanted to see a wild otter that I'd never seen before, so we went to Otter Cliffs. And the details of the death, I feel, should be brought out in court and shouldn't be brought out at this time, but there was no murder involved.
The following year, Larson tells the same story to a Maine judge. After 8 days of testimony, he is found guilty of first-degree murder. The victim's mother, Audrey Pomeroy, has believed from the day she heard about her daughter's death that Larson was a killer. She is present for his sentencing.
I wanted him to get life. I was kind of disappointed the judge gave him 50 years, but it's better than 20.
Larson is locked up at Maine's Thomaston State Prison, and the case of Kathy Frost is brought to a close. But 2,500 miles west in Montana, there is another family waiting for an answer. "15 years ago, Lois Reynolds' daughter Lesley apparently drowned after slipping into Montana's Prickly Pear Creek. With Lesley that day was her husband, Dennis Larson, the same man now serving time at a Maine prison for murdering another wife and collecting her life insurance money. By a not-so-happy coincidence, Lesie Larson also had an insurance policy, one that Dennis Larson duly collected after the alleged drowning, even though Leslie's body was never found. After Larson's conviction in Maine, Lois Reynolds has no doubt her daughter was murdered and her killer was also her husband.
I was leaning that way anyway, but that proved it to me, that he was capable of that.
Larson's murder conviction provides fresh hope for Reynolds. She puts a call in to the Montana Department of Justice and investigator Joe Uribe.
Lois was very well versed on the entire case. She had followed it from beginning to the time when I met her, and in fact did most of the investigative work at that time. And she believed that Lesley was murdered by her husband, Dennis.
After reviewing the case file on Leslie's apparent drowning, as well as the Maine homicide, Uribe has no doubt that Dennis Larson killed Lesie Larson. The investigator attempts to build a case against his suspect and continues the search for Leslie's remains. 10 years later, there is still no body, and Uribe doubts he will ever make a case for murder, unless he can get Dennis Larson talking.
When he told me he was going to go back to Maine, I said, "What for?" "I want to talk to him." And he said, "I'm going to get him to confess, because I think he's guilty." And I said, "Well, good luck, Joe."
In the fall of 2000, Joe Uribe flies to Thomaston State Prison in Maine and sits down with Larson. He decides to play on the convict's conscience and uses Lois Reynolds as his trump card.
I told him that Leslie's mother, Lois Reynolds, had spent all of these years looking for her daughter, that she wasn't getting any younger, and she didn't want to die without knowing where her daughter was to put her to rest. He told me at that time that she's in the creek right where I said she was, and someday she'll surface.
Uribe's gambit fails, and he leaves the room no wiser than when he entered. 3 hours later, however, the detective gets a call. Dennis Larson wants to talk. Before making a statement, Larson tries to broker a sentence that would someday get him out of prison.
I asked that my punishment for my crime in Montana be set at a cap of 30 years to be run consecutively. That would mean I would return to Montana, spend another 10 years of my life in prison, and be over 80 years old when I get out. But at least I would have that light at the end of the tunnel.
Detectives provide Larson with no assurances of a deal. Undeterred, the convicted murderer continues, giving specific details of Lesie Larson's last moments on Earth.
I found a spot along the creek that there was a large tree that had fallen down into the creek, and the water was rising up pretty bad. And I pushed her in at that point. And she got tangled up in the limbs and couldn't come up for air because the stream was rushing by too quick. And she drowned right there.
Justice. It's finally justice for Lois. The most important thing was Leslie's mother. She wanted justice out of this case. This man had never been addressed. This issue had never been addressed. And finally, he had come forth and taken responsibility for Leslie's death.
Justice, however, sometimes has its own way of balancing the scales. Just 3 months after confessing to Leslie's murder, Dennis Larson's body is found at the bottom of the Thomaston Prison rock quarry, a clothespin on his nose, and his mouth wrapped with tape. Scrolled across the tape is the word Geronimo. The official cause of death is listed as suicide. To this day, Lesie Larson's body has never been found. Her empty grave a poignant question mark to the final mystery for Lois Reynolds. Where is her daughter's body, and will it ever be laid to rest?
We spent every waking moment up here, I think, on weekends, trying to find that spot, because we were sure she was there somewhere. And now, of course, I have no idea. I don't think she went to the river. I never will. Everybody else seems to think that way, but I don't.
Okay, this is the crime scene. There's blood on the front of her blouse. Appears to have numerous stab wounds.
To me, the crime was very brutal. I mean, why is anybody stabbed not once, but 12 times? It was almost an overkill. I never held too much hope that it would be solved, but it was never forgotten.
On a soft spring afternoon, 15-year-old Penny Parker pedals her bike around the neighborhood, collecting for the Sacramento Bee newspaper she delivers. Her family expects the teenager home for dinner. 6 o'clock comes and goes with no sign of Penny. By 9 p.m., worry has given way to full-blown panic, and Penny's family calls police.
The Sacramento Police Department organized a team to canvass the neighborhood, go door to door. That developed more information with witnesses who had seen Penny that afternoon walking with an individual.
The individual with Penny is described as a white male in his late teens, with shoulder-length brown hair. Witnesses claim Penny was walking with a man along the railroad tracks and levee near her house. The next morning, neighbors and police search the area. Penny's brother Dennis joins the hunt.
I had a Jeep at the time, and I'd go out up and down the levees going through where they had been looking for her, and I didn't find anything. But the next biggest thing I remember was they had found her bicycle.
Penny's bike, a gold 10-speed, is found about a mile from her home. For her family, the implications are beginning to take hold.
That's a bad feeling. So you just starting to hope that, you know, she'd at least be alive.
3 days later, Dennis Parker gets a call about his little sister. It's a phone call that changes his world forever.
And I got a phone call from a son of the neighbor, and he said, I just heard on television that they found her. And I said, what? So I rushed back to the house, and about that time the coroner officers and the police department showed up, and I wouldn't let them go in and tell my mother. I went in and told my mother.
Okay, this is the crime scene. The body is in a small gully that runs along here with a row of trees. So there's a body laying right through the branch in there.
Penny Parker's body is found in a copse of woods about 7 miles from her house. The victim is fully clothed, stabbed a dozen times in the chest and neck, with her throat slashed.
Walking in on the railroad tracks northbound.
Peter Willover is one of the first detectives on scene.
I responded to the scene about 7 or 8 o'clock at night. I could recall it being a very emotional scene because of Penny's condition.
There's blood on the front of her blouse. Appears to have numerous stab wounds.
In the days following, the woods where Penny's body was discovered are combed for clues, but offer up nothing. At autopsy, the coroner recovers semen from Penny's body and establishes that the victim was strangled as well as stabbed.
To me, the crime was very brutal. I mean, why is anybody stabbed not once, but 12 times, and the throat slashed, and strangulation also? It was almost an overkill.
Willover begins his hunt for a killer by talking to the volunteer searcher who found Penny's body, a 21-year-old named Don Jennings.
He told his brother-in-law, you take the car and go in one direction, I'll walk off and look over in this area. And Mr. Jennings went directly to the body. We had a couple, husband and wife, who were in the area fishing at the time and observed this from a distance, who gave statements to us that it looked suspicious to them the way he went directly to the area where Penny was found.
Jennings found Penny Parker's body after only a few minutes of searching, a fact Willover is uneasy with. Jennings is white, with shoulder-length brown hair, a perfect fit to the man last seen with Penny on the day she disappeared. Then Willover discovers Jennings has a prior record for child molestation. The volunteer is quickly changing from a hero who found a young girl's body to a suspect who might have killed her. Willover asks Jennings to take a lie detector test. He agrees and passes. In the days before DNA, there is little more detectives can do.
We didn't have too much to hang our hats on. People who had seen Penny walking with this unknown male individual did not identify Mr. Jennings when they were shown photo lineups. Nobody could really positively identify him. There was not enough to make an arrest at that time.
In the months following, few new leads surface. Reluctantly, police are forced to let the case go cold.
They continue investigating, and the lead didn't really pan out. But, you know, they thought they had their man, but they just couldn't prove it.
It was a case that never left my desk, and I'd see the parents quite often and would sit and talk. I never held too much hope that it would be solved, but it was never forgotten.
"24 years after Penny Parker's rape and murder, Sacramento County has established a new cold case prosecution unit headed up by Anne Marie Schubert. The Parker case comes up for review.
Penny's case was probably, if not at the top of the list, within the first couple that we talked about. And because of the tragic nature, the fact that she was a teenager, the fact that she was sexually assaulted and murdered, it just kept coming back to that.
The Parker evidence is pulled out of storage. When the boxes get to the cold case unit, however, there's a problem. Penny Parker's autopsy kit, containing semen samples collected from the victim's body, can't be located.
Our department property room had moved a couple times, and a lot of the evidence was lost in the process. In the beginning, we felt terrible because we were being told by everybody that our evidence was no longer in existence.
Then police catch a break. A pair of the victim's underwear, worn the night she was raped and killed, is found stuffed inside one of the evidence boxes. Initial tests indicate the presence of semen. Investigators send the underwear to Jeff Herbert, a criminalist with the Sacramento County DA.
I took the pair of panties, and I needed to take a couple samples from the crotch area of the panties where we knew there was semen present. So I did that, and I was able to extract the DNA off those samples that I took.
Herbert gets only a partial profile from the degraded sample. Then the investigation catches a second break. Slides taken from Parker's autopsy are discovered in the files of the medical examiner. They too are tested and provide a full genetic profile. Herbert downloads the profile into the California Cold Hit database. In a matter of moments, it is compared against the DNA of more than 150,000 violent felony offenders. The search comes up empty.
We knew that at that point that all we really needed to do was to find the person that matched that profile. I mean, the answer's in the profile, basically.
Police now know the identity of their killer. The problem is, that identification comes not by way of a name and address, but is encoded in the form of a DNA sequence.
Looking at all the circumstances of the case, I thought that Don Jennings was a really strong suspect. I just thought it was odd that he would find the body so quickly, and that was the main thing that jumped out at me.
An unknown genetic profile is lifted from semen discovered at the crime scene. Cold case detectives want to run it against Jennings. The suspect, however, lives in Arkansas. Further, detectives don't want to tip off the suspect that the case is once again active. WAG consults with County Prosecutor Anne Marie Schubert, who believes there might be a way to get a look of Jennings' DNA without ever leaving the state.
I thought about it, and I knew that he had a wife, ex-wife, and I knew that he had a daughter. And I sat at a meeting, a DNA meeting, where we meet with some of the criminalists, and I said, can we do this? Would this work? And they said, yeah.
What we thought was, if we could locate his ex-wife or a biological child, then we could get samples from them and compare it to what we had.
Jennings' ex-wife, Cynthia Wood, and the couple's daughter, Melanie, still live in Jennings' old neighborhood. WAG tracks them down and asks Cynthia some pointed questions about her ex.
He asked me, did I remember Don Jennings? And I said, yeah. He started asking me questions, and I said, are we talking about Penny Parker? And he said, yes. And I said, well, he killed that little girl. And he said, well, that's what we're going to find out.
She had thought all along that Don could be a suspect because she didn't necessarily believe the story, and she had heard some things on the streets at the time.
WAG asks for and receives saliva samples from Donald Jennings' ex, as well as his biological daughter. Then Wag and Schubert stake their hopes on a bit of DNA sleight of hand, also known as a reverse paternity test. Criminalist Jeff Herbert is about to attempt his first reverse paternity test. The process involves 2 steps. First, Herbert compares DNA from Jennings' biological daughter to DNA from her mother. After stripping out the mother's profile, the scientist should be left with 1/2 of the father's genetic code, that is, the code of Donald Jennings.
So I did that. We took the reference samples, developed their profiles, and I was able to extract out half of Don Jennings' profile.
Jennings' partial profile is then compared to semen samples pulled from the victim's clothing and body. The result? A match. Good evidence, but not good enough by itself to support a charge of murder.
I believe in this case it came out to 1 in 10,000 that somebody else was the source of that semen. But I knew we needed his reference sample to compare every marker and every type on those panties are indeed from him, to rule out the possibility that anybody else was there.
To clinch the case, cold case detectives need to get a DNA sample from the suspect himself. And to do that, they need to go to Arkansas. In the dark chill of a hot springs winter, Arkansas police are called upon to escort California detectives Gary Wag and Peter Willover to the home of a local resident. Don Jennings lives 3 miles outside the city limits. In 1997, he lost both of his legs in an accident and is now confined to a wheelchair. Investigators do not expect any problems from their suspect.
He was completely caught off guard. We identify ourselves, and I don't think he was surprised to see Hot Springs detectives, but when the Sacramento officers identified themselves, you could just see the look in his eyes like, why are they here?
It's kind of a shock to see him because this is a person that in your mind, you know that he's probably killed this girl, and all of a sudden he's right there in front of you.
Detectives Willover and Wag questioned Jennings once again about Penny Parker, how he found the young girl's body more than 25 years ago, and whether he might have more to add to his story.
Do you remember what I told you about the girl that you found, the body?
Yeah.
In 1977, do you remember that?
I remember
finding the body.
Yeah.
Okay.
About all.
Okay.
I couldn't tell you where it was or whatever. I have nothing to hide.
Good.
His only response was, there has to be a mistake. I've never had sex with her. I didn't know her. I just happened to stumble on her body that day.
Wag and Willover decided not to press Jennings on his involvement. Instead, they collect a sample of the suspect's saliva and send it back to California, confident that science will put the lie to Don Jennings' story. 6 days later, that confidence is rewarded. Jennings' DNA is a perfect match to semen pulled from the Parker crime scene, and a warrant is issued for the suspect's arrest in Arkansas. A day after the warrant is issued, Arkansas detectives Billy Harviton and Chris Chapman arrive on Jennings' doorstep. Despite the suspect's physical limitations, investigators expect the pickup might be a difficult one.
We go out to the house, and of course we are prepared for a tactical situation this time. We're trying to effect an arrest for a murder warrant, and so we're in our best, and we're prepared for whatever happens.
Of course, when we got there, we knocked on the door and there was no answer. And we continued to knock and announced ourselves to the police department, told them we had an arrest warrant. No answer, wouldn't come to the door. So Detective Chapman looked in the window.
Through the window, Chapman can see the suspect's empty wheelchair and Jennings himself stretched out under a sheet on his bed. The detectives again call out to Jennings to open the door. The suspect moves under the sheets but makes no attempt to comply.
We force entry through the front door, and as we're going through the front door, we're maybe 10 feet into the house, a good 3 or 4 steps into the house going towards the bedroom, and we hear a gunshot. And at that time, we're not for sure if he's shooting at us or he had shot himself.
The smell of gunpowder lies thick in the air as Chapman and Harvatan make their way down a corridor towards Jennings' bedroom. Again, the detectives call out to the suspect to show himself and surrender. The requests, however, are met with silence. Finally, they turn the corner into the bedroom where they find the suspect still in bed, eyes open but unseeing.
And that's when we were able to actually see the gunshot wound and the firearm. And at that point, we removed the firearm from his hand and called in the paramedics because we knew that he had shot himself.
Don Jennings is declared dead on scene from a single gunshot wound to the chest. Arkansas's first call is to the original case detective, Peter Willover.
When I heard Mr. Jennings committed suicide, it certainly wasn't the phone call I expected, nor did I want that. I was disappointed. Now the two people who know what took place out in that field are now gone.
Detectives pass the news along to the victim's family, which has waited 25 years to confront Penny's killer.
My first reaction was, that bastard, is what I said. And then I started thinking, I said, well, actually that's probably the best for everything. He gave us what the state of California wouldn't have been able to give us, and that was the death penalty.
Ultimately, when you look at it, he's going to get his own justice, and he did get his own justice in his own way. And what matters is that they got the answer they'd waited for, and they knew who it was that killed their sister.
In a homicide investigation, the scales of justice never really balance. No amount of time in jail or method of execution will return a loved one to their family, or wash away the memories of a life that might have been. Dennis Parker understands that bit of wisdom and lives with its memory every day.
She was the type of person, you wondered what she would have done with her life, what she would accomplish in life. That's the sad thing, is that at a young age of 15, your life is taken from you.